got a few more minutes. I'm gonna Okay,
What did Mark have?
Mark, I can't remember. It was his shoulder, I think, and he is out because he was traveling this week to visit his children in Mississippi, and so he's at a point where he's doing outpatient therapy, is what I've heard. Good morning. So we're jumping back in John chapter what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to. We're at 8. Okay.
8:20.
I think we're at before Abraham was, I am. That caption, so verse 48. So I'll give everyone a chance to flip there. Seems like after 3 weeks we're going to make it out of John 8, which is okay. Some of this, the thing about John's gospel, I'll reiterate, is that the language in it is simple enough that we can understand it very easily. I'm not that great at Greek, and the Greek in John is some of the easiest ever. It's not that hard. It's beginner stuff. But some of the things that are said are so deep that we have to reflect on them. So Jesus is having this discourse with the Jews, is how John addresses them, probably members of the party of the Pharisees. It could be members of the priestly class, but they're arguing because, Jesus is talking about coming from his Father. And they don't like the implication of what Jesus is saying. He hasn't said it, I guess, clear enough, so they're trying to understand. But Jesus keeps reiterating the main point, the main reason of this gospel is that if we have faith, if we believe in Jesus, if we know the truth, we're set free from sin, from death. If we refuse to believe, and that includes refusing to believe who Jesus says he is, fundamentally, well, we run into trouble as the Jews here who are disputing with Jesus. So do we have someone who wants to take 48 through the end of the chapter?
The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan, and have a demon?" Jesus answered, "I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you the greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him, I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham, I am."
Right. Was before Abraham was, I
He
am.
was.
Which, yeah.
So
Sorry.
they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple.
Okay, sorry for stealing your thunder
That's
there,
all
Ed. So what we get here is the conclusion of this whole discourse. And I always like to put back in our minds, I know that we talked about this last week. The chapter begins with the woman caught in adultery. And it's stunning the difference between her, who's been caught in sin. All Jesus has to say to her is, does anyone condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, neither do I. Go and sin no more. That's a picture of what faith looks like, the forgiveness of sins, receiving that. The Pharisees, the Jews here, they refuse to believe any of what Jesus is offering. They've hardened their hearts, and to the point where they're saying that Jesus has a demon. And we tie this to that passage. I've talked about the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. John knows that his readers are aware of what the other scriptures say. And so I think he's demonstrating something very similar to what we hear, when they say in other gospels that he's casting out demons in the name of demons, and Jesus has to rebuke that. What's interesting is just the lack of faith that the Jews here have in what they believe. If they are Pharisees, which it's hard for us to tell because just the generic word Jew is used here. It's somebody from that camp. It could be from the priestly party, but if they are Pharisees, notice that they kind of are denying the resurrection from the dead. Where do you think we see that? Because I'm going to quote another gospel in a minute, but I didn't notice this before, but if you look kind of in the middle, when they start talking about Abraham. Yeah, what did they say? Abraham died. What does Jesus say in Mark's gospel? I won't quote the whole pericope, but remember the Sadducees approach him and they ask this question about the man who took a wife, or the wife who took a man and he died, and then the brother had to take her as husband, and then 7 brothers did this. Jesus' answer isn't to try to untangle that web. He knows what they were really asking about, the resurrection. And what does he say? Just hear what Jesus says in Mark's gospel. Is this not the reason you are wrong? Because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For when they raise from the dead, they neither marry or given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And we like to get caught in that verse and unpack what that means. But Jesus is pointing to the reality of the resurrection here. The Sadducees were asking, denying it. But he doesn't continue on that thought. Verse 26, and as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong. Unwittingly, because they want to deny Jesus' words and get him in a gotcha, they're denying that Abraham lives by faith. And that's really where this ends up falling. They claim that they are children of Abraham, and they're so enraged, that Jesus is saying these things, that they actually deny that Jesus could possibly be a child of Abraham. Or at least they try to distance him from themselves as what, they considered their bloodline as Jews to be pure, unadulterated. And what do they insult Jesus? They don't just call him a demon, but they called him a Samaritan. I don't think that that's, missing the point. A lot of what the Jews at that time began to believe and what was really wicked in God's sight was that they thought because of their heritage, because they were children of Abraham by bodily descent, by their blood, well, they were more blessed than any other people on earth. And because of that, when Jesus starts to talk about what it really means to be a child of Abraham, which falls down to faith in God, they get outraged. They don't even want to acknowledge that Jesus is related to them. But Jesus says, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. This is a passage that points to the reality of the resurrection. Sin is not enough to keep us away from this if we have faith. Why? We see the Samaritan woman is forgiven of her sin. She's sent away, cleansed, forgiven. Yet because they deny this fact, they're actually robbing themselves of their greatest comfort. So going on to verse 54, I think we pointed out what the problem was with how the Jews responded. And Jesus' response, it points to that resurrection of the dead. If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. And they want to deny that Jesus worships their God. They want to say, no, Jesus, you come from Satan. You're not teaching the right things here. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do not know him, and I keep his word. And we see some of this also show up surprisingly in the crucifixion. What do the people tell Jesus to do when he's hanging on the cross? To save himself, right? To come down if you are really the Son of God. But because Jesus truly is God's Son, he knows that the greatest blasphemy would have been for him not to do what his Father sent him to do. That's why Jesus on the cross, he responds by quoting scripture back to them. When he quotes Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? We see that, as a cry of dereliction. And in that moment, Jesus is alone. He's receiving the Father's condemnation for sin. Not that he is deserved. But if you read all of Psalm 22, it doesn't end with that dereliction. There's a lot of crying out to God there. I'm a worm and not a man. But what we see at the end is a belief that, God will vindicate this suffering servant. I will tell my brothers. And so what Jesus is saying is that if he were to deny that he was God's Son, he would be denying the whole reason he came into this world. If he were to make his teaching more palatable to their sensibilities, he would be lying. And he's not going to do that. Instead, he points to the truest comfort that we can receive from this. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. It's not just that he's saying that back then Abraham believed, but he's speaking in a sense that even though it's past tense, it's, hey, Abraham saw this day coming. He saw what God would do. And that's what makes us children of Abraham. It's not a fleshly descent. And the beautiful thing about the gospel, right? There's neither Jew nor Greek. That implies, though, that there are plenty of Jews who are part of this church. It's just they're no longer by blood. The blood doesn't matter. It's only the blood of Jesus. They're grafted in just as we are. All nations get to be part of this promise. And all get to be children of Abraham truly. So the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old and you've seen Abraham. And this is where Jesus makes it as clear as he can. You've heard millions of sermons on this. I won't belabor it. But before Abraham was, I am. Ego eimi. He's quoting God's name unmistakably. In the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, that Exodus, tetragrammaton, Yahweh, as people say that it's pronounced, but but I'm not going to get on this whole pedestal that we really don't know how it was pronounced, because if you know Hebrew, you have to write the vowels in. And they didn't write the vowels in for that four-letter name. They just put the vowels for Adonai, which is where you get in some churches, they say Jehovah. Jehovah is just the vowels for Adonai put on top of the name Yahweh, which I'd say we really don't know, and I don't, God has a name that we can call on. It's Jesus, and that's wonderful. We know how Jesus' name was said, and we know that he is God. He says so himself. And because he says that, they're at the point where they're done talking. They pick up stones to throw at him, but it's not his hour yet. It's not time for him to die for the sins of the world. He has more that he has to do. It's so, of course, they're unsuccessful. He once again miraculously avoids their attempts to kill him. So contrasting the Pharisees and the Jews who know about the scriptures, who know about Abraham, and because of their great knowledge, they refuse to believe the truth. Now we're going to see a literal blind man and how he responds to Jesus. And so let's start at chapter 9.
Can I ask you something?
Yes, go ahead.
Abraham seeing my day. So what is my day? And then is he seeing it from the past and knew, believed he would see it, or he's up there in heaven looking down, seeing something, or how?
Abraham's.
I
mean, the way that I take it there, that the reason why he can say Abraham saw it, and the reason why even saying that Abraham died to Jesus, he doesn't accept that. And we get a clearer verse about this later with Lazarus when he talks to Martha, and she talks about the resurrection. He says, well, whoever believes in me will never die. And I've recently started to take, especially at funerals, that very seriously. If Jesus says, he who lives and believes in me shall never die, then your grandma was right when she said they're just sleeping. It wasn't just a cutesy way of avoiding talking about death. Death for the Christian is a different experience than for the unbeliever. That's a great comfort. It's more like sleep than death. And that's beautiful. And so Abraham seeing his day, I take it as he believed. He had true faith. He didn't maybe understand all the particulars. Seeing isn't believing. And we're going to see that with the blind man. A literal blind man sees. I don't think that that's not insignificant. Abraham saw God's promise to him. And that's how and what was that promise? If you turn back to Genesis, the promises made to Abraham are that through you all nations will be blessed. And the way that verse is understood even to this day among those who are children of Abraham by descent, I have to be careful here how I say it, they'll say that means that the Jewish nation blesses the world, so that all nations are blessed by getting to serve these people. Abraham understood it rightly, that God's redemption for the whole world would come through him. And that's how we ought to understand it, in the same light as Abraham. I did a whole Bible study about this. If you read Paul's argument in Galatians, it's eye-opening that he compares Zion, Jerusalem, because at Paul's time there was still a temple. He compared that to Hagar and to Ishmael. He said, those who are descended by the flesh, well, Ishmael was descended from Abraham by the flesh. But true children of Abraham believe the promise given to Abraham. And indeed through Abraham's offspring. Which, again, that was the other promise, right? We learn in Sunday school. God tells Abraham that you will have descendants that outnumber the stars. Impossible if we're just talking about children according to fleshly descent. But when we consider all the nations, all the people who've been saved by the gospel, I've said this many times the last few weeks, but think of that old song, Father Abraham, right? I am one of them, and so are you. So let's praise the Lord. We are children of Abraham if we have true faith. And that's what Jesus is pointing to them. And they should be that's the sad thing about the Jews here who argue with Jesus. They should be the first to rejoice at this. Paul, he marvels just at his heritage, that whole long list where he talks about being from, the tribe of Benjamin, being, part of that heritage, having the law, having the traditions. But what did Paul say? I count it all as rubbish compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ, my Lord. So faith is what gives us this great treasure. And so Abraham sees it. I would assume he sees it when God makes that promise to him. Look at the stars. Your descendants will outnumber them. And we're told constantly in Genesis regarding Abraham that he believes God's promise, and God counts that belief, that faith, as righteousness.
So it's not contemporaneously with this passage
Yeah.
going on that it's seeing.
The word there is past tense. So but Jesus does point to the reality of the resurrection. Right. And I think there's also that implication. Abraham believed during his life, and because he's part of the church triumphant, he lives to this day. Which, if anybody is watching at home with their little children in tow, cover their little ears. That's why I don't have a problem. I was talking to my son about Saint Nicholas versus, Santa Claus. Well, St. Nicholas is alive. Why? He had faith. He believed. And I'm happy to tell him, he asked me, how old is Santa Claus? Well, St. Nicholas is about 1,700 years ago he lived.
Old man.
Now, you don't have to I don't know. I play the game with my son. But the thing is, we tried to be the whole, we're not going to do Santa Claus in our house family, and because our son is 7 years old, he believes not just in Santa Claus but in dragons and all sorts of other things. So you can't change a child.
What a great age.
What a great age, right? But that's our great comfort, and Abraham gets to see Jesus's day not just by faith. I mean, think about it. In the other Gospels, you have the Mount of Transfiguration, and Moses and Elijah are there. And Moses also clearly died. So make that of what you will, So I'm not going to answer definitively because I'm not sure if it's clear from here, but if we just connect the dots from what we believe, Abraham lives. That's kind of the argument Jesus makes, and he lives because of his faith in a living God, a God of the living. So good question though to unpack there. Any other questions on chapter 8 as we close and move on to the blind man? All right. Let's read the first I'll say 17 verses.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Do must work the work of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud for saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
And we'll unpack more of this, but just as Jesus performs this miracle, he gives us a great answer to a question that we often face as believers. If you know, and it's one of the arguments. Okay, they call it the cross of theology. I forget the Latin term. The cross of the theologian is explaining the problem of suffering. Why do people suffer in the world? Because even to this day, the atheist can say, okay, you can say all of this about God and whatnot, but then why does I still remember it was Christopher Hitchens. He was on it wasn't Larry King. It was some other guy who I don't like as much. So I'm not. Maybe I shouldn't say who it was. But I remember, they were grilling him about belief in God. And Christopher Hitchens said, well, why does the young child get bone marrow cancer? And of course, the people in Jesus' day had an explanation, and they're trying to get the answer from Jesus. Who sinned, this man or his father? Which sometimes you talk to Christians, and that's how we like to answer those problems of suffering. Why is this person suffering? Well, they're suffering because of their sins. Even when we as Lutherans try to polish that answer up, we'll say, well, it's because we live in a broken and fallen world. But the reality for those who have faith is different. Jesus tells us, and it's not just about this man who's blind, and I don't really want to get into, well, does he have faith before or after he comes into Jesus? We don't, meets with Jesus. I think what Jesus is saying here, though, in verse 3, addresses all of those who believe. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. When we believe in Jesus, even our suffering becomes transformed into something greater. And I've seen this in my life. Pastor Kyle does believe in miracles, and I believe that I've seen a few of them. In my last church, there's a little boy who had a very rare form of brain cancer. He had to go to St. Jude's, and it was just such a difficult time for that family. But we kept that child on our prayer list. We prayed and prayed, and the child was healed. And if you don't have faith, you can say, well, he was healed by the science or the medicine, which, yes, God can use those things to accomplish his purposes. But I think that, by bringing healing to this child, we can ask all day, well, why did God allow this little child to suffer this? Well, God healed this child to bring glory to himself. And you might say, well, what about the children who end up dying? And I'd say that glory that God will show through them will be revealed in the resurrection, right? So that's something to keep in mind. When you pray for the person at their hospital bed, that God might make them better, and then they die. God hasn't shut his ears to your prayer. He's just answering it in a different way in light of the resurrection. I remember at my last church, there was a gentleman who had a very sudden turned for the worse. He was in church one Sunday, and then a few weeks later, he died. And I remember sitting there with him, and his wife of many years said, well, he's going to come home. And, after the funeral, she told me, I told you he would come home. She had faith. She trusted God. God displays his glory even through the things in this life that are unpleasant to us. And I'd say that he delights in, especially those who trust and believe in him, in bringing them healing. That's why it is to God's glory when you see, something like that miraculously happen. I think a few weeks ago, it was maybe a month ago now, Michelle, her cousin, had that experience where she was, in a coma. And we prayed for her on Wednesday, and then the next morning, Michelle sends a text that she woke up. God does these things to show his glory, and to help us see that he is there. But even if the person dies, and we'll see that especially with the case of Lazarus, we have hope in the resurrection. We can have faith. So the works of God might be displayed in him. If you are suffering, you can trust that it's not because God hates you, or God has turned his eye against you, or that he's mad at you for some sin. If you're a Christian, you have the forgiveness of sins. That's a constant reality. You are covered by Jesus' blood. What that means is that your suffering is not a punishment. It's something, one, to discipline you, but two, as a means for God to show his glory through some working. And I've seen that in my life too many times for me to go on here. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. There's another I am statement. And in this case, what does light do? If I turned off all the lights, it would be hard for you to read your Bibles, right? It helps you see. He's going to demonstrate this very clearly. He takes spit on the ground and he makes mud with the saliva. When we talk about this miracle in confirmation, all the kids go, ew, because it is kind of the gross miracle, It's like when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. That's also weird to explain and understand. But we see a demonstration of God's power. He's here to do the works of the Father. And I can tell you that I could spit in the mud all day, take it in my hands and rub it on a blind person's eyes. It's not going to cure their blindness. But because Jesus is the Son of God, he can do things that we cannot do. And so he's able to work this miracle. Go and wash in the pool of Siloam. How do we know that this man had faith? We're not given a statement. Well, Jesus gives him a command. Go and do this. And what does the man do? He went away and he washed and came back seeing. Not going to make it a big point, but when we talk about the role of works, how they prove our faith, it's like this. We're saved by believing, right? But when we have faith, we do what God commands us to do. Noah's Ark is another example. If God told Noah that there was a flood, and to build the ark, well, Noah's faith is what saved him, right? But he still did what God commanded. And we don't understand this in a way that maybe our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, if do, where they say that it's faith plus works. It's faith that saves. And we'll see that the blind man is going to powerfully demonstrate his faith. He's going to face persecution in some ways for it. And it starts with the neighbors who saw him as a beggar. People are refusing to believe that this man was healed. And he keeps saying, no, I am the man. He's not ashamed of it. He doesn't really know that much about who this Jesus is, but when asked, he says, "It was the man called Jesus who anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." It's very simple to this man. That's what faith is. It's a very simple thing. We trust what God promises and receive what he gives us in response to that. And because of that, we are changed. In this case, the man goes from being blind from birth to having his sight. In our cases, in our lives, God transforms us. We become more like him. We grow in faith. We do more of what God desires us to do. That doesn't mean we aren't still sinners. We still struggle with that. I have to throw that in there. But the power of faith is just that. So let's any questions before we read on, because we're going to get into the difficulty that this man experiences, and I think we stopped at verse 13, right? So do we have somebody who will read on until 23?
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him."
So there's already persecution going on among those who are starting to see what Jesus is doing and believing. If anyone says Jesus is the Christ, they're kicked out of the synagogue. And it's something that causes the disciples later to have fear. And the parents here are afraid. And I think we all share this fear in common. There are times where we are tempted to be timid in our faith when we're surrounded by our peers. I have friends who think they know everything, and, I guess like attracts like. I know that nobody was going to say that, but I remember one time I accidentally, instead of posting a meme in the group chat, I posted a link to my Bible study, and one of my friends said, "Wow, you sound like a pastor." And even though it was written with text, I realized that was not a compliment. It was very interesting and eye opening. There are moments where we're going to be belittled. Our intelligence will be belittled for having simple faith. There are going to be times where if you confess the things that we ought to believe as Christians, you'll have that same punishment hanging over your head, that you will be put out of polite society. It happens even in the Western world these days. We have to not have fear. It's easy for us to say that. I think it's a great comfort that we see not just this blind man's parents struggle with this, but later on, even Peter is going to struggle and is going to sin on that account. And thankfully he's restored. There's the promise of forgiveness. But the parents have fear, and so they're not going to directly answer the questions. They don't deny that it's his son. And notice that the Jews, they don't believe even that this man had received his sight. Their faith has blinded them so much that they're not going to believe that a miracle has occurred. And that's something about miracles that I'll circle back to, is that if you don't believe in miracles, you're never going to see one. If you do, and I have this great big book, Miracles Today, and all this guy does, he doesn't take account for what denomination. He just looks at the various Christian accounts of miraculous healings, times where there's medical evidence. Hey, this person was in the hospital. This medical report said this, and then the next report, they were healed, and the doctors don't have an explanation. That does happen in medicine, where miraculous healings just happen. If you don't believe, well, you'll come up with 1,000 different reasons why it couldn't be a miracle. If you believe, you'll believe that everything is miraculous, right? Just waking up today. Pastor Kyle getting up today was a miracle. I woke up at 4 o'clock, went back to sleep, and it was 6:30 when I turned over and I said, I guess I have to go to church today. It's a miracle. The man's blind, he receives his sight. And notice they want to deny Jesus because he breaks their tradition. That's really the crux of the issue. Even the whole thing of Jesus saying that he is God's son. Would they have believed it if he was willing to tell them the things they wanted to hear? Jesus is not, a God of one ideology or another. He is the Lord. And so, there's something that Jesus says that will always cut through to what our sinful hearts want to prop up. So the parents, out of fear, deny him, and they just say, you know what, ask him. So let's continue to verse 34. We'll try to get through as much of this as we can today. It's a long bit of text, but here we get, I think, this blind man truly demonstrating his faith.
So, go ahead.
So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, Whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see. They said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You also want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, You were born under sin. You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? Get after them.
And I think that, I hate to say it, but there are pastors who take this attitude. You would tell me what to teach as your pastor, as the man that God anointed to send to this place? Perish the thought that I would ever say that kind of thing. We see here, a simple man understands it. And that's the beautiful thing. We kind of, me and Seth were jabbing as we usually do about things. And I was talking about a doctrine that we hold in our church, the perspicuity of the scriptures. That's your $5 word for the day. Perspicuity, it just means it's clear. And the question I get when I say that it's clear, I even had an elder once say, yeah, they're clear as mud at points. And what he's talking about is, two types of clarity. And I've been doing some research into this, a little book with lots of good points about, you know, as a pastor, I have to read a book called How to Understand Sacred Scriptures, let the reader understand, right? But actually, it points out that there's an external and an internal clarity. And by external, what it's talking about are the promises of God, the things that come to us from out of the scriptures. And when it comes to those simple things of faith, right, um, the scriptures are clear. You can read them and understand. And this man understands this very clear external matter, right? You say that Jesus is a sinner because he breaks your tradition, that he can't come from God. That was the whole dispute in chapter 8. Why we've had to spend 3 weeks going through it, because they get caught on that point. And the blind man sees better than the Pharisees. I think John is employing some irony here, dramatically. He's recording a real miracle, but there's a great effect where the blind man tells them very plainly. This is an amazing, even verse 30. I don't know how you can't read it without a little bit of sarcasm. What an amazing thing! You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. Right? And take it for what it is. Faith acknowledges what God has done for us. God has saved me, forgiven me of my sins. We know that can only come from God's Son dying for us, just as this man only knows that, hey, this man must come from God in some way. He doesn't understand everything yet. But he says that he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Just the law in its simplest form here, as every common person who was Jewish would have known, was that, well, God listens to those who obey his commands. How can you say Jesus is sinning if he performs this miracle? Right? In the same way that, we get in the other gospel, they accuse Jesus of performing miracles in the name of the devil. Well, we're getting a little bit of clarity on that. That's impossible. Jesus would be able to do none of his miracles if he did not truly come from God. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And again, they respond with just utter, pomposity, just complete indignation to this man. Whereas, he has faith, regardless of anything else. He believes what Jesus has done for him. And so we'll conclude this chapter with verse 35 to the end here. Jesus talking to this man blind.
Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains."
Right? And what about blindness? Especially in this man's case, he was blind from birth, which we know you can't help that. Things happen that cause a person to be blind from birth, and they can't choose to be blind. And that, I think that really highlights the crux of the whole issue that Jesus has had for these 2 chapters with the Pharisees. This man has very simple faith, just like the woman at the well. That question comes up: do you believe in the Son of Man? The woman at the well ends up asking about Messiah, and when Messiah comes, and eventually it gets led, well, who is Messiah? And Jesus says the same thing. He says, it's me. I'm right here. This man believes instantly. Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And you don't worship something that you well, I'm trying not to use a double negative. You only worship God, right? So this man, by worshiping Jesus, is accepting with a very simple and pure faith what Jesus has told him. He didn't even understand before, but he recognized what God has done for him. Which is why I'll say often, the Lutheran way is saying that faith is not a matter of understanding. You can have all the learning and read all the books in the world, and, you can still be blind to what is true. And that goes back to the external versus internal clarity of Scripture that we were talking about. Internally, we need Bible study for the difficult things that come up. When somebody says, Pastor, I struggle reading the Bible because of all these names and, all of these things in the Old Testament. And those things are not internally clear. You kind of have to study to understand them. But the beautiful thing about the things that are external, that come to us from God, the promises concerning life, those things are only discerned by the Spirit. They're only discerned by having true and living faith in God. And so, even if you don't know better, you can read, especially a gospel like John's gospel. And I know we're going to be done for today soon, which is a shame because we're going to get to the really good stuff. Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. Those are the things that we can read and trust and kind of, rest on. And it's beautiful that it comes to us freely. We know that we have guilt, but Jesus didn't come into the world for those who could help themselves. He came for the blind, right, to give them sight. What about these who think that they see? The people who have sight already? Well, they become blind. Why? Because they refuse to believe. And really, if you want to do the whole Lutheran thing where we point to the 10 Commandments and find a sin that the Pharisees are falling into, it's gross idolatry. They're making an idol out of their tradition. We don't make an idol out of tradition, but we have lots of things that we make idols out of. If I told everyone to come on a Saturday and miss the LSU game, we'd find out the idol. No, okay. But there are other things we idolize. Our comfort, our wealth, our ability to have power, tradition. Lutherans, we also have our traditions that we love and cling to. And we think that as long as we follow the traditions, everything else is fine. It's faith that saves us. And the traditions have an important role in that. But if it's going to lead us to say that, somebody is a sinner because they aren't falling into our tradition. And I remember this is something that I had to deal with in another church is, I was preaching and I forgot to light one of the eternal candle. It was out. And so someone got up and took a lighter and while I was preaching lit the candle. And the thing is, it's not a sin if you forget to do that. It's not a sin if you forget to bow at the altar. And that's something that is tough for us Lutherans to hear. We want to make our traditions matters of sin, but they aren't. Just as Jesus healing on the Sabbath was not a sin because he was doing it to show God's glory. And really, if you think about that commandment of keeping the Sabbath holy, well, if the Holy One from God does a miracle that causes people to believe in him, he is, by definition, keeping the Sabbath holy. Don't work on the Sabbath. Well, pastors have to work on Sunday, the Lord's Day, as it were. And guess what? It's so that God might be glorified. Things like Sabbaths, they're not an excuse to disobey God. We can't call someone a sinner because they break those traditions. Anyways, any other questions before we close? The Pharisees, and we'll just end it in the chapter here. If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. What they're doing is hard-hearted denial. And we can't deny Jesus with a heavy hand like that and expect to be saved. We must, if we are in that kind of sin, turn back to him in repentance. I could probably spend a whole nother hour talking about how this forgiveness is so great that even if you can't confess your sin to a pastor, the reality of being a baptized Christian means you constantly have the forgiveness of sins. When we invoke our baptism at the beginning of service, making the sign of the cross, that's a remembrance of baptism. If you do that, you're saying, I know that I was baptized. I am worthy to be and to receive what God offers because he already covered my sins in that wonderful gift, so that I can hear his word and live by it. So any comments, thoughts, anything to reflect on anything today? We got through not just chapter 8, but chapter 9. I think that's a miracle in and of itself. If any goers, going once, going twice, no? Well, then we are at the 10:15, so we'll say the Lord's Prayer and get ready for worship. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.